Christopher stood on the marble portico, sneering as he threw Joanna's suitcases into the gravel, telling her she was finally evicted from his life, never suspecting that the very ground he stood on belonged to her father. Welcome message. Welcome back, my wonderful family and friends. I am Mr. ZAHA. Thanks for tuning in today. A kind words from a man who has seen it all. Marriage are not mostly bed of roses, sometime you need more of. More of what? Can't say. Continue watching, and you will surely know what to do in situations like this. Kindly hit that subscribe button and drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from. Tomorrow, I'll be bringing you another exciting story you definitely don't want to miss. So let's get started. The Sterling Heights estate was not merely a house. It was a 20-acre manifesto written in limestone, glass, and unbridled arrogance. Perched on a cliffside overlooking the churning Atlantic, the mansion stood as a monument to Christopher's self-made ascent from a hungry, middle-class boy to a titan of the real estate industry. To Christopher, every gold-leafed molding and every imported Italian marble tile was a testament to his own genius. He moved through the cavernous halls with the stride of a conqueror, convinced that the world, and everything in it, had a price tag he could easily afford. His wife, Joanna, was the one thing in his life that didn't seem to fit the brand. She was quiet, observant, and possessed a stillness that Christopher often mistook for weakness. While he decorated his life with loud successes and flashy acquisitions, Joanna moved through the house like a ghost of the woman she used to be. She spent her time in the estate's sprawling botanical gardens, her hands stained with the rich earth of her heritage, tending to rare orchids and heirloom roses that Christopher barely noticed unless he was pointing them out to a business associate. "I've spent $3 million on the landscaping alone this year," Christopher would brag during his legendary weekend galas, waving a crystal glass of aged scotch toward the horizon. "It's the finest private garden on the eastern seaboard. Only the best for my kingdom." Joanna would stand by his side, her smile practiced and thin. She had tried, in the early years, to tell him about the history of the land. She had tried to explain that Sterling Heights wasn't just a plot of dirt bought at an auction, but a legacy property held by the Vanderbilt Blackwood Trust for over a century. But Christopher never listened. To him, Joanna's past was a series of vague stories about a modest family in the city. He had assumed she was a girl of humble means who had hit the jackpot when he placed a 5-carat diamond on her finger. "You should be more grateful, Joanna," Christopher said one evening, his voice dripping with the condescension that had become his primary mode of communication. They were in the grand library, surrounded by leather-bound books Christopher had never read. "You were living in a 2-bedroom apartment when I found you. Now, you're the queen of the most prestigious estate in the county. A little more enthusiasm at the charity auction tomorrow would be appropriate." Joanna looked up from her book, her eyes reflecting the warm glow of the fire, but her expression remained cool. "Christopher, prestige is a heavy cloak to wear. And this house, it isn't a kingdom. It's just a building. Buildings can change hands. Pride, however, is much harder to get rid of." Christopher scoffed, the sound sharp and metallic in the silent room. "Cryptic as always. That's the problem with you, Joanna. You have no drive, no vision. You're content to just exist within the world I've built for you. You don't understand the fire it takes to own something like this." The tension between them had been simmering for years, a slow-acting poison fueled by Christopher's increasing detachment from reality. As his net worth climbed, his humanity seemed to diminish. He viewed his marriage as a subsidiary of his corporation, something to be managed, optimized, and discarded if it didn't yield a sufficient return on his ego. He didn't see the way Joanna looked at the owner's seal engraved above the fireplace, a crest she had known since she was a toddler. He didn't see the way she whispered to the head groundskeeper, a man who had served her family for 40 years, or the way the estate's board members greeted her with a reverence they never showed him. Christopher was so blinded by his own light that he couldn't see he was standing in a shadow larger than his entire empire. The breaking point didn't come during a grand catastrophe, but during a dinner party intended to woo a group of international investors. Christopher had insisted on a menu of exorbitant, showy dishes, gold-flaked wagyu and truffles flown in from Italy. Joanna had quietly suggested that the investors, who valued tradition and understated elegance, might prefer a menu that highlighted the estate's own organic harvest and its historical significance. You're trying to make me look small. Christopher hissed at her in the kitchen, his face flushed with a dark, petulant rage. You want to serve garden vegetables to men who control the global markets? You have no class, Joanna. You're a drag on my reputation. I'm the millionaire here. I'm the one who understands how to play the game. I'm not trying to make you look small, Christopher, she replied, her voice a calm contrast to his shouting. I'm trying to keep you from looking like a fool. These men don't want to see your money. They want to see your character. And right now, all they see is a man who thinks his checkbook is a substitute for a soul. Christopher's hand tightened on his glass. The insult, delivered with such quiet precision, shattered the last of his restraint. In his mind, Joanna was no longer a wife. She was a liability. She was the one flaw in his perfect, gilded world. I'm done with your character lessons, Christopher roared, the sound echoing off the copper pots hanging from the ceiling. I built this. I own this. And I don't have to listen to a woman who brought nothing but a suitcase to this marriage. He marched out of the kitchen and up the grand staircase, his footsteps thundering like a drum roll of impending doom. Joanna followed him, her heart hammering against her ribs. She knew this tone. She knew the look in his eyes, the look of a man who believed his power was absolute. He entered the master suite and began yanking open drawers. He grabbed 2 designer suitcases, the ones he had bought her for their anniversary, and began throwing her silk dresses and cashmere sweaters into them with a violent, reckless energy. Christopher, stop this. You're being hysterical, Joanna said, standing in the doorway. Hysterical? He turned, a manic glint in his eyes as he shoved a pile of shoes into the bag. I'm being decisive. I'm optimizing my life, Joanna. You're a failing asset. I want a divorce, and I want you out of my sight. You think you're so wise. Let's see how wise you are when you're back in that 2-bedroom apartment, paying your own way. He dragged the suitcases toward the door, the heavy wheels thudding against the marble. He didn't stop until he reached the grand portico. He flung the oak doors open, revealing a gray, drizzling sky that matched the coldness in his heart. This is my kingdom, Joanna, he shouted, throwing the bags onto the gravel driveway. The rain began to darken the expensive leather of the suitcases immediately. And you are officially evicted. Don't call my office. Don't call the lawyers. Just go back to the nothing you came from. He shoved her out into the rain. The chill hit her skin, but she didn't flinch. She stood on the gravel, looking up at the man she had loved, the man who had become a caricature of himself. You're making a mistake, Christopher, she said, her voice steady even as the rain soaked through her silk blouse. This house, it has a long memory, and it doesn't belong to people like you. I am the millionaire, he screamed, his voice cracking with the strain of his ego. I own the deed. I own the dirt. Now get off my property. He slammed the massive doors, the sound of the deadbolt clicking shut feeling like a final sentence. Christopher leaned against the wood, breathing hard, a sense of dark satisfaction washing over him. He felt lighter. He felt powerful. He was the king of Sterling Heights, and he had finally purged the one thing that challenged his rule. But outside, Joanna didn't move toward the gate. She stood in the rain, watching the lights of the mansion she had grown up in. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, encrypted phone, one she only used for family business. She dialed a number she hadn't called in years. Dad? It's Joanna. Yes, he did it. He threw me out. He thinks he's the owner. She paused, a small, sad smile touching her lips as she looked at the sterling crest he had added to the gate. A crest that was about to be removed. I think it's time for a change in management. Call the board. I want the eviction notice served by morning. No, don't be gentle. He wants to know what it feels like to own the dirt. Let's show him who the dirt actually belongs to. As Christopher poured himself a celebratory drink in the library, convinced he had just won the greatest battle of his life, the invisible wheels of an empire much larger than his were already beginning to turn. The billionaire he had never met, the man whose daughter he had just cast into the rain, was already signing the papers that would turn Christopher's kingdom into a prison of his own making. Before we witness Christopher's world turning to ash, I want to ask you, is there anything more dangerous than a man who mistakes his bank balance for his worth? Christopher thinks he's the king of the castle, but he's about to find out he's just a tenant who forgot to pay his emotional rent. Tell me in the comments, how would you feel if you found out your humble wife actually owned your entire life? The rain turned into a downpour, washing away the tracks of the suitcases in the gravel. Inside, Christopher sat in his leather chair, staring at the fire, oblivious to the fact that the very ground beneath him was shifting. He was a millionaire, yes, but he was about to learn the difference between having money and having power. And Joanna? She wasn't going back to a two-bedroom apartment. She was going to the hotel her father owned downtown, to wait for the sun to rise on a very different version of Sterling Heights. The morning after the eviction, Christopher woke up with a sensation of absolute victory. The rain had cleared, leaving the Hamptons' air crisp and smelling of salt and expensive pine. He stood on his balcony, looking out over the manicured lawn, feeling like a weight had been lifted. No more quiet judgments from Joanna. No more talk of character or legacy. He was the sole master of Sterling Heights, and he intended to celebrate his newfound freedom by closing the biggest deal of his career. He went downstairs to the breakfast room, expecting his usual service. Instead, he found the kitchen silent. The chef wasn't at the stove, and his coffee hadn't been poured. "Maria? Thomas," Christopher called out, his voice echoing in the marble hall. The head groundskeeper, Thomas, a man who had been at the estate longer than Christopher had been alive, stepped into the room. He wasn't wearing his usual work jacket. He was wearing a dark suit, and his expression was as cold as the Atlantic. "They've left, Mr. Sterling," Thomas said. The entire staff was instructed to take a paid leave of absence by the estate administrators. Christopher paused, his hand hovering over a piece of dry toast. "Estate administrators? What are you talking about? I pay their salaries. I'm the administrator." "Not according to the deed, sir," Thomas replied, handing him a thick, cream-colored envelope embossed with a wax seal Christopher didn't recognize. "This was delivered by courier an hour ago. You might want to read it before you start your day." Christopher ripped the envelope open. His heart hammered against his ribs as he scanned the legal jargon. It wasn't a bill or a request for maintenance. It was a formal order of vacation and immediate eviction. The Vanderbilt Blackwood Trust, as the primary deed holder of the property known as Sterling Heights, hereby terminates the lease to occupy agreement held by Christopher Sterling due to a violation of the moral and ethical conduct clauses outlined in the trust's bylaws. "This is a mistake," Christopher hissed, his face turning a dangerous shade of red. "I bought this property. I paid $15 million for it." "You bought a 99-year lease, sir," Thomas said quietly, his eyes showing a flicker of satisfaction. "A lease that was approved by the board of directors on the recommendation of the trust's primary beneficiary. It seems that recommendation has been withdrawn." Christopher's world began to tilt. He grabbed his phone, ready to call his lawyers, ready to sue everyone in a 100-mile radius. But as he looked at the name at the bottom of the document, the signature of the trust's chairman, the phone slipped from his fingers. Arthur Vanderbilt Blackwood, the reclusive billionaire, the man who owned half of the skyline in New York, the man whose daughter, the document explicitly stated, had been wrongfully and forcefully removed from her family's ancestral home. Before Christopher's knees hit the floor, I have to ask, have you ever realized that the person you were protecting was actually the person protecting you? Christopher thought he was a lion, but he was just a house cat sitting on someone else's throne. Tell me in the comments, is this the ultimate poetic justice, or is the Vanderbilt family being too harsh? The next few hours were a blurred montage of humiliation. Christopher's lawyers wouldn't even take his calls. His bank accounts, he discovered, had been flagged for source of funds verification by the trust's parent bank, a move that effectively froze his liquid assets. He was a millionaire on paper, but he couldn't even pay for a taxi. At noon, a black sedan pulled up the driveway. Two men in suits stepped out, accompanied by a local sheriff. "Mr. Sterling," the sheriff said, his tone professional but firm. "You have 60 minutes to collect your personal effects. The trust is taking physical possession of the property. Any items remaining after 1 o'clock will be considered abandoned and donated to charity." Christopher stood in the grand foyer, surrounded by the art he didn't understand and the furniture he had bought to impress people who didn't like him. He felt small. He felt like a child being scolded in his own playground. He didn't have his designer suitcases. He had thrown them into the rain the night before. He was forced to pack his $1,000 suits into plastic trash bags. He felt the eyes of Thomas and the other staff members on him as he dragged the bags across the marble. They weren't looking at a titan of industry. They were looking at a tenant who had been evicted for bad behavior. As he walked toward the front door, the same oak door he had slammed on Joanna, he saw her. A silver Mercedes Maybach was parked at the end of the driveway. Joanna was standing next to it, sheltered under a large black umbrella held by a man Christopher recognized as her father's personal assistant. She wasn't wearing her gardening clothes. She was wearing a perfectly tailored wool coat, her hair styled in a way that screamed old money and effortless power. She didn't look angry. She looked disappointed. "Christopher," she said as he reached the gravel, his trash bags slumped at his feet. "You did this," he spat, though the bite was gone from his voice. "You lied to me for 7 years. You let me believe I was the one." "I never lied to you, Christopher," Joanna interrupted softly. "I told you I came from a family that valued privacy. I told you that this land had a history. You just assumed that because you didn't see my name on the Forbes list, I was nothing. You were so busy being a self-made man that you forgot that some things are earned through centuries, not through one good fiscal year." "So what now?" he asked, looking at his trash bags. "You're going to laugh at me? You're going to watch me crawl into a motel?" Joanna looked at the mansion behind him, the house where she had learned to walk, where she had hid from her tutors, and where she had tried to build a life with a man who only saw her as a trophy. "I'm not going to laugh at you, Christopher. I'm going to let you experience the world you were so sure you conquered. You told me to go back to the nothing I came from. Well, I'm going back to my home. And you? You're going to find out what it's like to have no kingdom to hide behind." She turned and stepped into the car. As the door closed with a soft, expensive thud, the Maybach pulled away, leaving Christopher standing in the dirt of the driveway. He looked at the gate. The Sterling Heights sign had already been removed. In its place was a temporary banner for the Vanderbilt Blackwood Preservation Trust. Christopher picked up his trash bags and started walking. He didn't have a car. It was a company lease, and the company's board had just suspended his credentials. He didn't have a house. He had 2 bags of suits and a phone with a frozen bank app. The catalyst had done its work. The millionaire was now a man on the street, and the woman he had evicted was finally the lady of the manor. But as Christopher sits in a budget motel that night, staring at a flickering neon sign, the story isn't about his fall. It's about the arduous, painful climb back toward his humanity. Can a man whose identity was built on money find a soul when the money is gone? And will Joanna, now in the position of absolute power, choose vengeance or a far more difficult path, redemption? Tell me in the comments. Do you think Christopher can change, or is he destined to be a millionaire in his own mind forever? The neon sign of the Sleep Easy Motel flickered with a rhythmic, buzzing groan that seemed to mock the pounding in Christopher's head. The room smelled of stale tobacco and industrial-grade lemon cleaner, a far cry from the sandalwood and sea salt scent that had been pumped through the vents of Sterling Heights. He sat on the edge of a bed with floral polyester sheets, staring at the 3 black trash bags slumped in the corner. He had spent the last 6 hours on the phone. Or rather, he had spent 6 hours listening to the mechanical voices of automated banking systems telling him his accounts were locked for administrative review. He had called his vice president, only to be told that the board of his own company had convened an emergency session to discuss his sudden lack of housing stability and its impact on the firm's public image. Christopher, the Vanderbilt Blackwood Trust doesn't just own your house. His lawyer, Sarah, had finally told him in a hushed, panicked whisper before she, too, hung up. They own the debt on your office building. They own the venture capital firm that funded your latest acquisition. You didn't just kick your wife out, Chris. You declared war on the bank that owns your entire world. Christopher looked at his hands. They were clean, manicured, and currently trembling. He realized with a terrifying clarity that he was a man who had been built out of paper. He was a millionaire whose wealth was a complex web of credit, leverage, and the goodwill of a board of directors, all of which had vanished the moment Joanna called her father. As the first night of his new life set in, I want to ask you, is a man's worth determined by what he can buy, or by who stays with him when he can buy nothing? Christopher is finding out that without his gold, he's invisible even to his own employees. Drop a comment. Is this a fair lesson, or is Joanna being too cruel by taking his company along with the house? 3 days later, the millionaire was gone. In his place was a man who stood in line at a local diner, counting out his remaining cash for a cup of coffee. Christopher's face had been on the cover of the city's business journal just last month, but in the gritty reality of the street, nobody looked twice. He was just another man in a rumpled suit that had seen better days. He found himself walking back toward the gates of Sterling Heights. He didn't know why. Perhaps he hoped it was all a dream, an elaborate prank played by Joanna to teach him a lesson. But as he reached the wrought iron gates, he saw the transformation was complete. The Sterling name had been scrubbed from the stone. The crew was busy installing a new plaque, the Blackwood Botanical Sanctuary. "He's back again," he heard a voice say. Christopher looked up. Thomas, the groundskeeper, was standing on the other side of the gate. He didn't look angry anymore. He looked pitying. "She's not here, Christopher," Thomas said. "She's in the city, finalizing the conversion of the estate into a public trust. She wants the gardens to be open to the people, not just a playground for a man with a checkbook." "I just wanted to apologize," Christopher said, his voice sounding thin and foreign to his own ears. "I didn't know, Thomas. I didn't know who she was." "That's the problem, isn't it?" Thomas replied, leaning against the gate. "You lived with her for 7 years, and you never saw her. You saw a decoration. You saw an asset. You never saw the woman who used to sit in these dirt beds and cry because she was so lonely in that big house you built. She didn't stay with you for the money, son. She stayed because she hoped you'd eventually remember how to be the boy she met at that gallery." Christopher looked at the dirt beds Thomas was pointing to. He remembered Joanna coming inside with mud on her knees, and he remembered scolding her for ruining the aesthetic of the foyer. He hadn't asked her why she was gardening. He had just seen the mess. The tension peaked when a black SUV pulled up to the gate. The window rolled down, and a man with silver hair and a face carved from granite looked out. Arthur Vanderbilt Blackwood. "So, you're the one," the old man said, his voice like the grinding of tectonic plates. "You're the man who thought he could buy my daughter's soul and then throw it away when it didn't suit his brand." Christopher couldn't speak. The sheer weight of the man's presence, the actual power, the centuries of legacy, made Christopher feel like a speck of dust. "My daughter is a romantic," Arthur continued. "She told me not to destroy you. She told me to just return you to yourself. But I'm not as kind as she is. Your company is being liquidated, Christopher. Your assets are being used to fund the sanctuary. You're going to find out what it's like to work for a living. Maybe then, you'll understand what a self-made man actually looks like." The SUV drove through the gates, and they closed with a heavy, final thud. The rising tension had reached its zenith. Christopher was no longer just evicted. He was erased. He spent the next month working as a laborer for a construction crew, the very kind of crew he used to bark orders at from his air-conditioned office. His hands became calloused. His back ached. He learned the name of the man who worked beside him, a father of 3 who took the bus 2 hours every day just to put food on the table. For the first time in his life, Christopher wasn't looking at the bottom line. He was looking at the people. But the real test came when he received a small, plain envelope at the halfway house where he was now staying. Inside was a single key and a note in Joanna's elegant, familiar script. "The sanctuary opens on Sunday. I need someone who knows the soil. Not a millionaire. Just a man who isn't afraid to get his hands dirty. If you want to see the flowers, come to the garden gate at dawn." Christopher stood at the garden gate as the sun began to bleed over the Atlantic. He wasn't wearing a suit. He was wearing work boots and a flannel shirt. He looked at the mansion, but for the first time, he didn't see a kingdom. He saw a house that needed paint. He saw a garden that needed love. Joanna was there, standing among the roses. She looked at his hands, the calluses, the dirt under the fingernails, and then she looked at his eyes. "You're late," she said, but there was a softness in her voice he hadn't heard in years. "I had to take the bus," Christopher said. "It's a long walk from the station." Was it a hard walk? "It was the first walk I've taken in 10 years where I actually saw the trees, Joanna. I'm sorry. Not for the house. Not for the money. I'm sorry for being a man who forgot that the ground under his feet didn't belong to him." The tension broke, not with a grand reconciliation, but with a simple gesture. Joanna handed him a pair of pruning shears. "The roses are overgrown," she said. "Let's get to work." This concludes Act 3. This part reached 2,540 words. Should I proceed to Act 4? The climax, where their new relationship is tested by Christopher's past. The transformation of Sterling Heights into the Blackwood Botanical Sanctuary was nearly complete. The limestone mansion, once a cold vault for Christopher's ego, had been softened by the introduction of public pathways and educational centers. However, the true change was happening in the dirt. Christopher spent his days in the soil, his million-dollar suits replaced by canvas work pants and a denim shirt that bore the salt stain of hard labor. He was no longer the man who commanded the garden. He was the man who served it. Joanna watched him from the balcony where he had once stood to survey his kingdom. She saw the way he moved, slower, more deliberate, his arrogance replaced by a quiet focus. He didn't look up when her father's car pulled into the drive. He didn't look up when the former board members of his liquidated company arrived to settle the final debts. He only looked up when the sun moved, gauging the light for the sensitive ferns he was transplanting. The climax of their journey arrived on the eve of the sanctuary's grand opening. A sudden, violent Atlantic storm, the kind that Christopher used to ignore from behind triple-paned glass, roared toward the coast. The sanctuary's newest and most delicate installation, a collection of rare moonlight orchids that Joanna's father had spent 40 years cultivating, was at risk. The automated glass of the conservatory had jammed due to a power surge, leaving the priceless blooms exposed to the freezing salt spray of the ocean wind. "The manual override is stuck," Thomas shouted over the roar of the wind, his voice thin against the gale. "If those vents don't close in 10 minutes, the entire collection will be dead. It's a 40-year legacy, Joanna. Your father will be devastated." Joanna looked at the conservatory, perched precariously on the cliff's edge. The wind was gusting at 60 miles per hour. It was dangerous for anyone to be on the external maintenance catwalks. "I'll go," Christopher said. He appeared from the shadows of the tool shed, drenched to the bone, his eyes hard and clear. "Christopher, no," Joanna said, grabbing his arm. "The catwalk is slick. You aren't a technician. You could fall." "I know every inch of this building, Joanna," Christopher said, looking at the glass structure. "I spent 3 years obsessing over its construction because I wanted it to be a monument to me. Now, let me use that obsession to save something that actually matters to you." He didn't wait for her permission. He grabbed a heavy wrench and a safety harness, sprinting toward the external ladder. Joanna watched, her heart in her throat, as the man who had once been too proud to even carry his own groceries scaled the side of the building in a literal hurricane. As Christopher clings to the side of the glass palace he once called his own, I have to ask, is he doing this to win back the house, or to prove he's finally worth the dirt under his fingernails? The man who threw his wife out in the rain is now risking his life to save her father's flowers. Tell me in the comments, is this enough to earn a full pardon, or are some wounds too deep for even a heroic act to heal? On the catwalk, the wind was a living thing, trying to tear Christopher from the metal grating. The salt spray blinded him, and the cold seeped into his bones, but he didn't stop. He reached the jammed vent. The metal was twisted, a casualty of the house's age and the storm's fury. He didn't think about his bank account. He didn't think about the board of directors. He thought about Joanna's face when she talked about these orchids, how they only bloomed at night, and how they represented the only time she felt truly seen by her father. With a roar of effort that was lost in the wind, Christopher slammed the wrench against the gear housing. His foot slipped, and for a terrifying second, he swung out over the crashing Atlantic, held only by a single safety tether. He scrambled back onto the rail, his hands bleeding, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He struck the gear again. With a mechanical groan that sounded like a scream, the vents began to slide shut. The orchids were safe. Christopher slumped against the glass, the rain washing the blood from his knuckles. He stayed there until the wind began to die down, watching the gray light of dawn begin to touch the horizon. He looked at the mansion. It didn't look like a kingdom anymore. It looked like a responsibility. When he finally climbed down, Joanna was waiting at the base of the ladder. She didn't say anything. She wrapped a heavy wool blanket around his shivering shoulders and led him inside, not to the grand library, but to the small mudroom where the gardeners kept their boots. She sat him down on a wooden bench and began to clean the cuts on his hands. "Why did you do it, Christopher?" she asked softly. "You could have died for a bunch of flowers." "They weren't flowers," he said, his voice raspy. "They were your history. I spent 7 years trying to overwrite your history with my own. I wanted to save one thing that I didn't buy." Joanna looked at him. The man sitting before her was a stranger. Gone was the polished millionaire with the sharp tongue and the cold heart. In his place was a man who was exhausted, bruised, and finally, undeniably real. "My father wants to offer you a position," Joanna said, her fingers tracing a scar on his palm. "Not as a laborer. He wants you to oversee the development of the other trusts. He says a man who can survive a fall like yours and still want to plant something is a man he can trust with his legacy." Christopher looked at the owner's seal on the wall of the mudroom. He thought about the boardroom, the power, and the millions. Then he looked at Joanna. "I don't want the legacy, Joanna," he said. "I don't want the buildings. I want to stay here. I want to finish the rose beds. I want to be the man who knows the soil." "You can't stay here as a gardener forever, Christopher," Joanna said, a small smile finally breaking through. "The neighbors will talk." "Let them talk," he said. "For the first time in my life, I don't care what the neighbors think. I only care what the woman who owns the dirt thinks." The climax had passed, but the resolution was just beginning. The storm had cleared the air, leaving the estate sparkling and new. The millionaire had been washed away, and in the mud of the garden, something new was beginning to grow. The grand opening of the Blackwood Botanical Sanctuary was a triumph. The elite of the city arrived, expecting to see the scandal of the century. They expected to see Christopher Sterling in chains or in hiding. Instead, they saw a man in a clean work shirt, standing at the back of the crowd, clapping as Joanna Vanderbilt Blackwood cut the ribbon. He wasn't on the stage. He wasn't in the press release. He was exactly where he wanted to be, in the shadow of the woman he had finally learned to love. But as the guests began to file into the conservatory, Arthur Vanderbilt Blackwood walked up to Christopher. The old man looked at Christopher's hands, then at the orchids behind the glass. "You saved the Moonlight Collection," Arthur said. "I did," Christopher replied. "They tell me you turned down the executive position." "I did." Arthur nodded, a rare look of respect in his eyes. "My daughter has always had a better eye for value than I have. She said you were worth the investment. I suppose she was right." As Arthur walked away, Joanna joined Christopher at the edge of the cliff. The ocean was calm now, a deep, shimmering blue. "We aren't going to live in the mansion," Joanna said. "It's a museum now. I've bought a small house in the village. It has a tiny garden and a porch that needs fixing." Christopher smiled, a real, warm smile that reached his eyes. "Does it have a good foundation?" "The best," Joanna said, taking his hand. "Because we're building it ourselves." The transition from a mansion to a cottage was not a fall from grace, but a return to it. Christopher and Joanna's new home was a modest, two-bedroom cedar house tucked away in a quiet coastal village, 3 miles south of the now-famous Blackwood Botanical Sanctuary. The house possessed a sagging porch, a kitchen that had last seen a renovation in the 1970s, and a patch of land that was more weeds than grass. To the old Christopher, this would have been a prison, a humiliating footnote in a biography of success. To the man who had survived the Atlantic storm and the collapse of his own ego, it was a blank canvas. They moved in on a Tuesday, carrying their own boxes. Christopher's hands, once reserved for signing multi-million-dollar contracts and gesturing sharply at subordinates, now gripped the rough edges of cardboard crates filled with books, kitchenware, and Joanna's heavy ceramic planters. There was no staff to whistle for, no fleet of black SUVs to idle in the driveway, and no gold-leafed ceilings to reflect his own vanity. There was only the sound of the wind through the pines and the steady, grounding rhythm of a life being rebuilt from the ground up. "It needs work," Christopher said, standing in the middle of the small living room. He looked at the faded floral wallpaper, peeling at the corners like old skin. He didn't say it with the sneer of a critic or the disdain of a man used to five-star luxury. He said it with the breathy excitement of a craftsman seeing a raw block of wood. "It has a good foundation, Christopher," Joanna replied, echoing the word she had used to describe him during his darkest hour. She walked over to the window, looking out at the overgrown yard where the salt air had turned the weeds a hardy, stubborn silver. "And the soil is untainted. We can plant whatever we want here. We don't have to follow a blueprint." The first few months were a masterclass in humility. Christopher, who had once managed a real estate empire worth hundreds of millions, found himself struggling to master the internal plumbing of a 60-year-old sink. He spent his weekends stripping layers of wallpaper that had been applied during the Nixon administration, his fingers stained with paste and dust. He learned the specific groans of the house, which floorboard creaked when the temperature dropped, and how to jiggle the handle of the front door just right to make the deadbolt catch. He discovered a profound, quiet satisfaction in fixing something with his own hands. There was a directness to it that his corporate life had lacked. When he sanded a floorboard, it became smooth. When he patched a hole, the draft stopped. It was a world of cause and effect, devoid of the smoke and mirrors of high finance. In the evenings, they sat on the porch. Christopher had spent 7 years of marriage talking at Joanna, detailing his triumphs, his grievances with the board, and his plans for regional dominance. Now, he sat in the silence and listened. He learned about her childhood in this village, how she had hidden her lineage even at the local school to avoid being treated like a museum exhibit. He heard about her secret dreams of botanical conservation, dreams she had tucked away because there was no room for them in the kingdom he had built for himself. As the millionaire fades into a memory, I want to ask you, is a man truly rich if he has no time to hear the heart of the person sleeping next to him? Christopher had to lose his bank account to find his ears. Tell me in the comments, is it easier to love someone in a cottage than in a mansion, or does the setting not matter if the hearts are finally open? The true test of their redemption arrived with the first anniversary of the sanctuary's opening. Arthur Vanderbilt Blackwood, a man who measured time in decades and loyalty in blood, invited them to a private dinner. He didn't invite them to the estate, which was now filled with school groups and researchers. He invited them to his own primary residence in the city, a penthouse that was a temple to the very power Christopher had once worshipped. The penthouse was a world Christopher recognized, the scent of beeswax and ancient money, the silent servants who moved like shadows, and the panoramic view of a Manhattan skyline that valued more above all else. As they sat at the long, polished table, the city lights shimmering like fallen stars below them, Christopher felt a familiar, phantom pull toward his old life. He saw the way the light caught the vintage baccarat crystal, and for a split second, he missed the weight of being the man whom everyone feared. "You've done well with the cottage, from what I hear," Arthur said, his sharp eyes examining Christopher over the rim of his wine glass. "My daughter tells me you've become quite the carpenter, that you've fixed the roof and settled the plumbing yourself. Admirable, in a rustic sort of way." Christopher didn't flinch at the slight edge in Arthur's voice. "It's honest work, Arthur. It keeps the mind quiet." "But surely," Arthur continued, leaning forward, "you're tired of the dust. I've been looking into the restructuring of your old firm. The board is in shambles, the stock is undervalued, and the brand is tarnished. I could buy the controlling interest tomorrow. I could reinstall you as CEO. You'd be back on top of the world by Monday morning. You'd have the suits, the cars, and the respect back." Christopher looked at the sparkling city below. He saw the lights of the buildings he used to own, the ones he had climbed over others to acquire. Then, he felt Joanna's hand find his under the table. Her fingers were warm, her skin bearing the faint, permanent scent of rosemary and damp earth from their village garden. She didn't squeeze his hand to warn him. She simply held it, giving him the choice. "Thank you, Arthur," Christopher said, his voice steady and devoid of the old, hungry edge. "But I think I've spent enough time on top of things. I'd rather be in them. The company was a cage I built for myself. The cottage is a home I'm building with Joanna. I think I'll stick to the dust." Arthur looked at his daughter, then back at the man he had once intended to crush into the dirt. He saw the peace in Christopher's eyes, a peace that Arthur, despite all his billions, had rarely achieved. He saw that Christopher was no longer a tenant in someone else's life. He was finally the owner of his own soul. "I see," Arthur murmured, a rare look of genuine respect softening his features. "Then perhaps you'll accept a different offer. The trust is funding a series of urban lung projects, community gardens, and green spaces in the city's lower-income districts. We need someone who understands the technicality of land development, but has the heart to listen to the people who will actually use the dirt. It's not a CEO position. It's a boots-on-the-ground project. You'll be working with locals, not lobbyists." Christopher looked at Joanna. She was smiling, her eyes bright with a pride that no diamond could ever have bought. "I can do that," Christopher said, "as long as I can still be home in time to help Joanna with the roses." The years that followed were a symphony of quiet growth. Christopher and Joanna's cottage became a masterpiece of living art. The sagging porch was replaced with hand-hewn cedar, The weed-choked yard became a thriving ecosystem of native plants and heirloom vegetables. The neighbors in the village stopped seeing them as those wealthy people who lost it all, and started seeing them as Christopher and Joanna, the couple who brought extra tomatoes to the community center and helped fix the fence at the local school. The nothing Christopher had once mocked became the everything he lived for. He realized that the millionaire he used to be was a man who owned everything but possessed nothing. Now, he possessed very little, but he owned his time, his integrity, and the absolute trust of the woman he loved. The final, beautiful resolution came on a warm evening a decade later. They sat in the garden they had planted together, the air thick with the scent of lavender and salt. The moonlight orchids they had saved during the storm at the estate were now thriving in a small, hand-built greenhouse Christopher had constructed for Joanna's birthday. "You know," Christopher said, looking at his hands that were permanently calloused, a map of his decade of labor. "I used to think I threw you out because I hated who you were. I thought you were holding me back from being great." Joanna leaned her head on his shoulder, her silvering hair catching the twilight. And now I realize I threw you out because I was terrified of how much I needed you," he whispered. "I was a man who couldn't handle the truth of his own emptiness. I had to lose the castle to realize I was the one who was homeless all along." They sat in the deepening purple of the coastal evening, watching the first of the moonlight orchids begin to unfurl its petals. Christopher wasn't a millionaire anymore, and he wasn't the king of the castle. He was a man who knew the names of the birds in his trees. He was a man who knew how to make a home out of four walls and a heart full of truth. The empty house, from the beginning, was gone, replaced by a life overflowing with the only currency that never devalues. As the stars came out over the Atlantic, Joanna took his hand, and for the first time in his life, Christopher Sterling knew exactly where he belonged. Thank you so much for watching my story all the way to the end. Your support means everything. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and drop a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts.